What's up everybody, welcome back to the channel and another Outriders video. Now with the release of the latest patch, unfortunately a lot of the builds in Worldslayer took a massive damage hit. Now Eruption Pyromancer is unfortunately also affected by this, and so I spent some time rearranging some mods, adding some new things and getting myself back to what I would say a relatively good power level and the ability to still take down the Arbiter, the second Arbiter, with relative ease, as well as being able to do some really fast expeditions, which is kind of like a sweet middle ground when it comes to this build. And when it comes to what actually affected this build from the patch, the three main impact points are coming from the change to convection, meaning that you don't get your skills, aka your eruptions, back nearly as often as you did, meaning that we have to do some changes to our gear, we have to do some changes to our skill tree. Then also the change to no resistance against the fortified being nerfed from 100% to 65% certainly has hurt us, because we do utilize that whole armor piercing to resistance piercing to AP combo. And then last but surely not least, the nerf or the change, the correction, whatever you want to call it, to Mage's Rage, essentially chopping its damage, or rather its AP increase that it provided, by half, has also affected this build. Now when you combine all of those three things together, they offset the changes that People Can Fly have made to things like the skill tree, where we now see, you know, a little bit more AP coming from each one of the nodes in the bottom tree, as well as some of the changes which they made in the PAX tree to try and sort of circumvent this. So the two main issues with this build that we had to address with this update, or rather with this refresh of Eruption, for me especially here, was a way for us to still make sure that we get those eruptions back in a due amount of time, so that we're able to cast them more often, because that is our main damage source. But also on the other hand as well, being able to cast them often is good, but you also need to be able to deal real damage with them. So we need to be looking for ways of accentuating our damage profile against enemies, but more specifically against bosses like the second Arbiter. The net result to this update to my Eruption Pyromancer then means that I'm kind of like back to the point where I can do the second Arbiter with relative ease, obviously not dealing nearly as much damage as we were doing before by ramping up, you know, things like Mage's Rage and all of that. But at the same time, we're also able to do massive area clears and able to do expos with ease. So this build kind of like fits and straddles the middle now for me, between being able to do trials when I want to do trials, and also at the same time being able to do expos with relative ease. Plus, this is also the build that I primarily use to carry people, so it's also able to do that with relative ease. So when it gets to the actual build itself, we'll do the same thing we always do. We'll look at the weapons first, we'll look at the armor, we'll talk about the skills and the rotation, we'll have a look at the class tree, we'll talk about PAX points that you should be picking, and last but not least, I'll make some recommendations on what you should be targeting when it comes to Ascension points. Now please do ignore my transmog on here, it's the same transmog as before, but of course we want to be using the Lava Lich set, because we want access to that set bonus and all of the benefit that that affords Eruption. Now specifically when it comes to the weapons themselves, this is the part where I've changed basically nothing from the previous build. I'm still super happy with the two weapons that I have here, with the idea that one of them is a trash weapon that I run around with and just kill trash with, and the second weapon is a ramp up weapon that I use on bosses like the second Arbiter, or basically anything that's chunky and tough and that needs me to drop some serious damage on it. Now for the mobbing weapon, the weapon I use to just clear trash, I use an Air to the Desert, and actually for the ramp up weapon I use Air to the Desert as well. The simple reason being that both of those weapons, well, it's the same weapon, but it's a tactical assault rifle, which means you can land crits very easily with it, and secondly, it has armor pierce on it. Now we still use this mechanism of changing armor pierce into resistance pierce, and changing resistance pierce into anomaly power via no resistance against the fortified. Even though that took a hit from the patch from 100% to 65%, it still is free anomaly power for us, and that's a good reason to have armor pierce on your weapon. Now for the trash clearing weapon, we have Sandstorm, Deathronome, and Firestorm. The idea being with this weapon that we have two AoEs which essentially tick very fast. Firestorm is on a 10-second cooldown, Sandstorm is on a 5-second cooldown. It allows us to lock down certain areas where enemies are bunched up together, and it's a fantastic way to deal AoE damage over time, specifically Firestorm. Now Deathronome is just usually a flat increase to anomaly power for us, so it's just a nice way to boost up our anomaly by a little bit. Now when it comes to the ramp up weapon, again Air to the Desert here, so with Sandstorm on by default, but this then has Fortress and Mage's Rage on it. Now Mage's Rage is still best in slot, especially for a build like this where you want as much anomaly power as possible before you unleash your big eruptions on enemies. So even though this took like a basically got slashed in half, it is still quite necessary for this build to be able to produce the kind of damage that it does. Now Fortress is a great companion to this because Fortress got a small buff in the latest patch, increasing it from 20% to 25% additional damage, but it also affords you some survivability in your armor and resistance. So this is quite important, and it actually gives you a little bit of lasting power when it comes to taking damage while you are dumping your skills out on enemies. Now the pistol doesn't really matter, so we can go ahead and breeze past that. So getting into armor, of course, as mentioned, we want the Lava Leech set because we want those bonuses that comes with that to the eruption skill, but specifically when it starts with the headpiece, we can start with an Anomaly's Visage. Now quick note here, of course we want as much anomaly power on these pieces as we can, but we also need to reshuffle slightly and actually now have cooldown reduction on 3 of our pieces instead of the 2 that we were able to use before and still get to the same cap. That's because cooldown reduction also received a nerf with the latest patch, and so we have to bear that in mind if we want to also still have essentially eruptions available as fast as possible, even due to the fact that we also took a nerf with convection, which we also have to deal with. So the bottom line is you're going to have less eruptions more of the time now than you did before, and we have to try and find ways of essentially compensating for that, and 3 pieces with cooldown reduction is the first step towards doing that. Now on this Anomaly's Visage, I have Anomaly Echo on here, which is just a nice little buff to anomaly power every time we activate a skill for 6 seconds. Now we have relatively low cooldowns on 2 of our 3 skills, so we should have this up at all times. Increased duration on here is really good because Eruption has a 2-phase damage approach. Essentially there's an explosion at the beginning that deals damage, but then it also has a dot that boils essentially lava over time, and that duration is increased by 50%, which means you get more girth, you get more volume, you get more out of each cast of Eruption, meaning more damage over time. Ashen Boost is good for us here as well because of course we use Ash Blast on this build, and also there's ways for us to turn enemies from burning into ash via our class tree. So this is just going to give us a nice 12% increase in damage to those enemies that are affected by it. Now when we get over to the chest piece, this is our first piece of the Lava Leech set. And on here we have Death Sentence, which is a fantastic debuff mod from Ash Blast, which allows our anomaly damage to be 30% more effective or increased against enemies that are affected by Ash Blast. This is very important also for being able to deal decent amounts of damage against big enemies like the Second Arbiter. So absolutely you would need to find a way to get yourself Death Sentence onto the board. Giga Blast is a way for you to increase the radius of eruption by 100%. Now by default, Eruption's explosion radius and the distance that it covers is fairly large, but this doubles it, so it is massive. And actually you can use it to essentially, if you manage to plop it down in the middle of a room, you can usually cover from one room to the other side, especially in expeditions where you have tight corridors and not such massive open areas as you might see in Trials. Now we also have Captain Hunter on here because while trash is no problem for this build, of course Captain's Elites and more specifically red bar bosses is where we are going to slow down a little bit. So we want to be dealing more damage against them, so obviously Captain Hunter. Now on the pants we have our second piece of the Lava Leech set, and maybe it's time to quickly just refer to exactly what the set bonus for Lava Leech does. Of course it increases the eruption damage by 100%, which is really good, and more importantly, very importantly, it decreases its cooldown by 30%. Now, Eruption has a massive cooldown by default, so you need to be doing whatever you can to knock that cooldown value down so that you can actually deal more damage with more eruptions, of course. Now, Improved Damage is a tier 3 eruption mod that increases that initial explosion damage by basically 1 million, which is really good. This is 3 million additional damage to you just off this mod, obviously unscaled because you are able to cast 3 eruptions. Now, no resistance against the fortified here is part of that combo that I mentioned where we turn armor piercing into resistance piercing and then resistance piercing into our anomaly power. And this took a hit from the latest patch, reducing, originally it said increases your resistance piercing by 100%. Now it only says 65% of your armor piercing value. Now, Debris here throws damaging debris at enemies, dealing an additional 1 million damage. This is just a way for your eruption to further on reach for even more enemies and everything like that. And really, when it comes to the way that I I've built this, or the way that I think about the way that I want to play this, is I don't want to be really good at dealing with trash but not dealing good at dealing with bosses, and I also at the same time don't want to be like an absolute assassin on bosses but not able to deal with trash. So I've tried to tread the middle here and essentially create a build that is equally good at both things, and debris is one of those mods that helps you out with that. Then when we get over to the hands, this is our third and final piece of the Lava Lich set, and this has Etna on, which is super important. If you are choosing to run with only 2 eruptions instead of 3, I would highly advise you to run with 3 though, for that good boss killing potential. But if you are choosing to run with 2, Etna is absolutely the mod that you need, not Pompeii. And the reason for that being that both of them do the same thing, and that is that they give you an additional eruption. But Etna, being a tier 3 mod, actually also allows eruption to burn now, which is really important, because we have to be setting stuff on fire so that we can also benefit from bullet kindling, which is our mod at the bottom there. So then last but not least, we get over to our boots, and here I'm using boots of the Akari, because that drops with Master Consumer, and we do want Master Consumer because that makes overheat consume either burn or ash, and in the case of a mob having both of them on it, then it actually increases the damage of the overheat by 150%, which is good stuff. Arms and Anomaly is a great accompaniment to Mage's Rage, because to activate Mage's Rage you already have to be shooting and critting enemies. So this is just going to mean that with that first crit you're just going to get a whole bunch of additional AP as well, which is just an additional ramp up mechanic for you. Last but not least, Unstoppable Force is again part of that combo. So here you can see that it increases your anomaly power by 50% of your resistance piercing. So this is how we feed essentially armor into resistance piercing and then consequently into AP. So when we get over to the skills tree, I think it's fairly evident by now that we're obviously running Ash Blast, Overheat, and Eruption. You'll see that the Ash Blast and Overheat are on relatively low cooldowns. Actually, Ash Blast and Eruption are kind of like in the same ballpark almost. And so the point here being that the combo basically means that if you are trying to ramp up on a boss, you go Ash Blast, then you Overheat, and then you dump all 3 eruptions on them. Very straightforward. Hasn't changed since the way that we played at the beginning of this build of designing this, so that still stays the same. Now in the case of running around and messing with trash and everything like that, of course you are going to just be using your eruptions on big clusters of enemies, and generally don't shoot enemy like a single enemy that's running or something like that. It's probably not worth you dumping an entire eruption Mount Vesuvius on them. Just shoot them with the gun. But bottom line is, if you go Ash Blast, Overheat, Eruption, when you hit that 3rd eruption, then Convection is going to make sure that you immediately have an Ash Blast and an Overheat ready again. So that is a good way for you to essentially have a follow-up on that as well. Then on to the class tree. Now the major changes here from the class tree that we had before is that now we're trying to get as many nodes with cooldown reduction as we can, because we do want to be getting as close as possible to that 10-second cooldown for Eruption. Now in doing that, we are going to lose a little bit of damage, and that's simply due to the fact that we have to swap at least 2 points out for cooldown reduction nodes here. However, some of this is offset by the fact that Archmage, which gives us anomaly power by 15% for each node of those that we pick, has actually been buffed with the patch as well. Now that being said though, we do actually lose more damage than we gain overall, I would say. But what we're going to do is we're going to go down here, we're going to pick up all the additional anomaly power we can. This is the first place where we deviate, and we actually shoot up and we pick up Wildfire, which gives us 10% cooldown overall. Now Wildfire before was not working correctly, and this is also something that was addressed in the patch, so that's also one of the reasons why it's a good idea for us to grab it now. Then we also just move across here, and at this point in time we shoot just a straight line up all the way to the top, so we get to Hot Situation. Hot Situation is a great way for us to also ramp up anomaly power, because it gives us 45% anomaly power for 10 seconds every time we use Ash Blast. Now along the way we obviously grab Extinction and Incinerate, also 2 very important mods here, or rather nodes. Extinction being that we can deal a whole bunch of additional damage to enemies that are below 30% of the HP, which really does help you to get that final killing blow on something like the Arbiter for instance. And then also Incinerate is a fantastic way for us to also give ourselves a little bit of breathing room, but essentially ashen enemies because the minute they finish burning, they will turn to ash, which makes them stand still, which means we can hit them up with follow-up abilities, and we also benefit from the Ashen boost, which is a mod that we run on here, of course. Then we are trying to just go along till we get to the end, till we get to Grave Ablaze. So we are picking up as much additional damage as we can. We get gifted, we get another Archmage node. Here, instead of Unquenchable, we take Master of Resistance, just giving us a little bit more survivability there. We go all the way along, we get Flames that burn twice, which gives us additional damage against elites. We get ourselves another cooldown node here, just further on compounding that Eruption cooldown. And then we get ourselves Grave Ablaze, which is a nice flat 30% increase of explosive damage. So that is the reason why we are able to actually get very close to the 10% of cooldown reduction, or rather the 10% of duration for a cooldown to finish on Eruption. Now, when we get over to the PAX points themselves, we are of course going to go bottom, because we want to be able to get to trigger sequence. Now, this entire area also received some changes with the patch. But nonetheless, the idea would be, or at least PCF's idea was, that we would be relatively at the same power level that we were before. But the bottom line is the big change here, the convection changer, which used to read reduce all skills cooldown by 4 seconds when all skills are on cooldown, now reads reduce all skill cooldown by 2 seconds. And this is a pretty big nerf for us, and it's the reason why the build doesn't feel as snappy and as fast as it did before. However, there's no reason not to take it anymore still, because we definitely do need that cooldown reduction. So we want to get Melting Point, which just again increases our resistance piercing by 15 to enemy when we're above 80, and by 30 when we're below 40. This is again just you know, gonna boost up our AP a little bit through that whole exchange mechanism that we have. We have Master Exploder here, which says that our explosive skill damage is increased by 50% of our resistance piercing. There's a nerf here as well. This used to be 100%. This is one of the ones which we feel kind of like a lot more, I would say, just due to the fact that this meant that you had some versatility here, that you could take Master Exploder, and for instance, you didn't have to, you know, go all the way into trigger sequence in some variants of this build. Then we get Convection, of course. We get Backdraft, which says that your anomaly power is increased by 25% for every skill on cooldown. This was also nerfed, so this is less now as well. But then we get to Trigger Sequence, which was actually buffed. So Trigger Sequence used to say 25%, which was the stack on effect that it gave. So every eruption is essentially 25% more powerful. Now it is 35% more powerful. And this is why before, if there were different versions of this build that you were trying to do, and you weren't actually trying to go into Trigger Sequence, and you were still being able to deal relatively good damage because you were ramping up Mage's Rage. Now with the loss of Mage's Rage, the double effect essentially from that, and due to the fact that these nodes are weaker now, we'd absolutely have to go into Trigger Sequence to get even close, even though it's not close, but even close to the original damage profile that we had. Last but not least, on the Ascension points, I'm kind of like have almost all of it covered by now, but the main area that you should focus on for additional damage is obviously over here. So with your first 10 points going into anomaly damage, because that's just flat damage on top, then you can pick up additional anomaly power. You can get yourself some more resistance pierce and some more armor pierce, and it's definitely a good idea to get yourself this additional 5.5% cooldown reduction here as well as soon as you can. After that, depending on where you are struggling, if you're struggling with survivability, you can give yourself some more HP and some more armor. You can also give yourself less damage against, well, you can take less damage from elites, and you can also deal more damage. So this is dealing more damage against elites, and this is taking less. I don't know why I'm struggling to get that out. So this is less damage from elites, which means it's a little bit of damage mitigation, and this actually just allows you to deal a bit more damage to that. So I would say the priority would be 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, and probably, I think by that point you kind of like have it fleshed out where you're struggling. So either give yourself some more survivability then, or give yourself some status power or something like that. And that brings us to the end of the video and the build. Let me know in the comments down below how you've built your Eruption build. Does it perform adequately enough for you still? I think everybody's really disappointed with the massive damage hit that this build took. It was able to do some really kooky things before, and that was of course due to the fact that we were ramping up Mage's Rage so great, and because of some of the, you know, mods just being way more powerful than they are right now. But the bigger concern for me is, and this isn't really an Eruption point, but this is an overall Pyromancer point, is I feel that we have a lot less options in terms of what we want to build now to be able to deal decent damage. Now, I am still working on a bunch of my other pyromancer builds to bring them up to, let's call it, post-patch status now as well. And even though I've only now started looking at those, it's become apparent to me that a lot of the things which were viable before the patch and which we could have a lot of fun with before the patch is now simply just not good enough and does not compare to, you know, for instance, leaning heavily into eruption like this. This is still a very good build, and this might be the strongest meta build for being able to kill the arbiter the quickest. But as I said, I will come with more information once I test all the other pyro builds. And also at the same time, obviously feel free to let me know in the comments down below if you have a suggestion as to what I should try, or what do you think performs better than this. I'm always open to suggestion, especially when it comes to the pyromancer, and I love to have those discussions. That's it from me. Thank you so much for watching the video, especially if you made it this far. It's just super important to me that you have a fantastic morning, afternoon, and evening wherever you are in the world. And until next video, fucking cheers.
They want the best of me now, best of me now, best of me now, best of me. They want the best of me now, best of me now, best of me now, best of me.